He doesn't pay. The manager snapped, loud enough for the whole diner to
We
hear,
both know what
his
this is
voice cutting
about.
through the low hum
Yes,
of
we do.
clinking plates and murmured
Another coffee,
conversations
hun?
like a knife against glass.
Sure
And
thing.
Ava Brooks didn't look up right
Coming right
away,
up.
didn't rush, didn't
Thanks,
argue.
sweetie.
She just stood there behind the counter
I
with
saw
a
what you did
ceramic
that
bowl
night.
warming her palms, steam rising in
know.
soft curls that
I'm
fogged the
sorry.
edge of her vision as the neon sign outside flickered red and blue across the window, casting a restless glow over the chipped linoleum floor, the smell of coffee and fried bacon hanging thick in the air. And when she finally lifted her eyes, calm, steady, almost too quiet for the moment, she said nothing at all, because she had learned a long time ago that words didn't change people like him. People who wore authority like a second skin and measured worth in receipts and totals, and who paid and who didn't. But she still turned, still walked the 3 steps across the narrow aisle, still placed the bowl gently in front of the old man sitting alone in the corner booth, his coat too thin for the season, his hands trembling just slightly, as if the air itself weighed more on him than it should. And he looked up at her with those tired gray eyes that always seemed to search her face like he was trying to remember something he'd lost years ago, something just out of reach. And for a second the noise of the diner softened, like the world had taken a breath and held it, and Ava gave him the smallest nod, almost invisible, before turning back to the counter as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just risked the only job keeping her lights on and her mother's medication paid for, as if kindness was something you could afford to give away without consequence. But the manager wasn't done. He stepped closer, his shoes tapping sharp against the tile, his voice lower now but tighter, controlled. "You do that again. You're done here." And Ava could feel the eyes on her. A few customers watching, some curious, some disapproving. One man in a pressed white shirt shaking his head like he'd already decided what kind of person she was. And Ava just reached for a rag, wiped down the counter in slow, even strokes. The scent of bleach faint beneath the coffee. Her heartbeat steady, grounded, because this wasn't new. None of it was new. The judgment, the lines drawn between people who mattered and people who didn't, the quiet rules no one said out loud, but everyone followed. And behind her, she heard the faint clink of a spoon against the bowl, the old man eating carefully, like each bite had to be earned, and something in her chest softened just a little, the way it always did, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet warmth that settled in and stayed. And when she glanced back again, just for a second, she noticed the small details she'd started to recognize over the past week, the way he folded his napkin neatly beside the plate, the way he sat straighter than most, like habit had trained him long before hardship bent him down, and the old watch on his wrist, scratched but polished, catching the light in a way that didn't belong to someone who had nothing. And Ava looked away quickly, because noticing too much could get you in trouble, because asking questions could change things, and some things were better left as they were, simple, quiet, unspoken, just a waitress and an old man and a bowl of soup in a diner that never quite got warm enough. And outside, a car passed slowly, headlights sliding across the glass like a brief flicker of something distant, something coming. But inside, for now, everything held still, balanced on a moment no one else seemed to notice but her. The bell above the diner door gave a tired chime as it swung shut behind a pair of customers leaving, letting in a brief gust of cool morning air that slipped across the floor and brushed against Ava's ankles. And she shifted slightly behind the counter, tying her apron tighter as the early light filtered through the front windows in pale gold streaks, softer than the harsh neon from the night before, making everything look almost gentler than it really was. And for a moment the place felt quieter, like it had not fully decided to wake up yet. The coffee machine humming low, the scent of fresh brew stronger now, cleaner, and Ava glanced toward the corner booth before she even realized she was doing it, her eyes landing on the empty seat where the old man usually sat, the vinyl cushion untouched, the table clean except for the faint ring left by yesterday's bowl. And something in her chest paused, just slightly, like a step missed on a familiar staircase. But she shook it off, reaching for a stack of menus, aligning them carefully, because routines mattered. Routines kept things steady, predictable, and people like her learned to depend on that. But still, she found herself looking back again, just for a second longer this time, as if expecting him to appear out of nowhere, to shuffle in quietly with that same measured pace. That same quiet presence that never asked for anything but always seemed to notice everything. And when he did not, she moved toward the coffee pot, pouring a fresh cup for a regular at the counter, nodding politely as he muttered a thank you without really seeing her. And the morning carried on, orders called out, plates slid across the pass, the rhythm building, steady and familiar, but under it all, there was a small absence, a missing note she could not ignore no matter how busy her hands became. And when the clock above the register ticked past the time he usually arrived, Ava hesitated just long enough for the manager to notice, his eyes narrowing slightly as he followed her gaze toward the empty booth. But he said nothing this time, just turned away with a dismissive shake of his head, and Ava exhaled slowly, almost without sound, before reaching beneath the counter and pulling out a bowl, the same kind she had used the night before, her fingers tracing the rim for a brief second, as if confirming something to herself, and she ladled soup into it, careful, precise, the steam rising again in soft curls that caught the morning light. And when she carried it across the diner, there was no one to meet her halfway, no quiet nod waiting, no trembling hands reaching out, just the empty booth, still and waiting. And Ava set the bowl down anyway, gently, exactly where it would have been, aligning it with the edge of the table like she always did. And for a moment she stood there, her hand resting lightly against the back of the seat, feeling the cool vinyl beneath her fingertips, grounding herself in something physical, something real, before stepping back, her expression unchanged to anyone watching, but her breathing just a fraction deeper, a fraction slower, as if she was holding on to something invisible, something that did not need to be explained. And as she turned to walk away, the sunlight shifted again, sliding across the table and catching on the surface of the untouched soup, making it glow faintly, like a quiet promise no one else in the room could see. By noon the diner had filled with the usual rhythm of clattering plates and overlapping voices, the kind of steady noise that wrapped around you until it almost felt like silence. And Ava moved through it on instinct, refilling coffee cups, sliding orders across the counter, her steps measured, efficient, but every now and then her eyes drifted back to the corner booth, the bowl still sitting there untouched, the surface of the soup no longer steaming but holding a faint sheen under the overhead lights. And it should have looked out of place by now, should have drawn attention, but somehow it did not, as if the space around it had quietly agreed to leave it alone, and that unsettled her more than if someone had asked about it, because absence was easier to ignore when it blended in. And as she wiped down a nearby table, she caught the reflection of that empty seat in the window, layered over the passing cars outside, the world moving on without pause, without question, and she pressed the cloth a little harder against the surface, grounding herself in the simple motion, in something she could control. And behind her the manager's voice rose again, calling out an order, sharp, impatient, pulling her back into the present. And she turned quickly, delivering plates, nodding at customers, offering polite smiles that never quite reached her eyes, because part of her attention stayed anchored to that quiet corner, to the space that felt incomplete in a way she could not explain. And when the lunch rush began to thin, leaving behind scattered conversations and half-empty cups, Ava finally stepped toward the booth again, slower this time, her footsteps soft against the tile, and she stood there for a moment, looking down at the bowl, noticing the small details that felt suddenly important, the way the spoon rested exactly where she had placed it, the way the napkin remained folded, untouched. And she reached out, hesitating just before her fingers brushed the edge of the table, as if crossing some invisible line, before finally picking up the bowl, the ceramic cool now, heavier than it should have been. And as she turned to carry it back, a voice from the counter called out, casual, almost careless, asking for the check. And Ava paused just long enough to set the bowl down again, not in the kitchen, not yet, but back in its place, aligned just as before, like she was not ready to erase what it meant, not ready to accept that the routine had ended without warning. And she exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just a fraction, before stepping away once more, returning to the counter, to the register, to the steady exchange of bills and coins that defined the day. But the feeling stayed with her, quiet and persistent, like a question that had not been asked out loud. And as the afternoon light shifted, growing warmer, stretching longer across the diner floor, Ava caught herself glancing at the door every time it opened, every small chime of the bell pulling her attention for just a second, just long enough to check, to hope, even if she would never say it. And each time it was someone else, someone new or someone familiar, but never him, and still, without thinking, without deciding, she reached beneath the counter once more near the end of her shift, her movements slower now, deliberate, and she prepared another bowl. The same careful motions, the same quiet precision, carrying it across the diner and setting it down in that same seat, her hand lingering on the table just a second longer this time, as if acknowledging something unspoken, something that did not need words. And when she finally stepped back, the diner felt larger than it had before, the space around her stretching out in a way that made the silence between sounds more noticeable, more real, and outside, the late afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that slid across the glass and settled over the empty booth, holding it there in a soft, quiet stillness that felt like waiting. The sky had already begun to dim by the time Ava stepped outside for a brief break, the evening air cooler now, carrying the faint scent of asphalt and distant rain, and she leaned lightly against the side of the building, arms folded loosely, letting the quiet settle around her in a way the diner never allowed, her thoughts drifting back to the empty booth inside, to the untouched bowls, to the absence that had stretched from morning into afternoon and now into night. And it did not make sense, not in a way she could explain, because people like him did not just disappear without a trace, not when they had shown up every day with that same steady rhythm, that same quiet presence that felt almost intentional. And Ava closed her eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly, as if she could release the question from her chest, but it stayed there, persistent, unresolved, and when the door behind her creaked open, she straightened slightly, turning to see one of the kitchen staff stepping out with a cigarette, nodding at her without much thought before lighting it, the brief flare of the lighter reflecting in his eyes, and she nodded back, polite but distant, before pushing herself off the wall and heading back inside, because breaks were short and responsibilities did not wait. And as the door swung shut behind her, the familiar warmth of the diner wrapped around her again, along with the layered sounds of dishes and low conversations, grounding her back into motion, back into routine, and she moved behind the counter, picking up where she had left off, her hands finding their rhythm. But something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like a thread pulled just slightly out of place. And when she glanced toward the corner booth again, she noticed it more clearly now, the way the space seemed to hold on to its stillness even as everything else moved, the way the light above it flickered once before settling, casting a soft, uneven glow across the table, and Ava found herself stepping closer without fully deciding to, her movements slower now, more deliberate, and she reached the booth, standing beside it as if approaching something fragile, something that might break if handled too quickly, and her eyes moved over the details again. The same arrangement, the same quiet order, but now it felt heavier, like it carried something she had not noticed before, and she slid into the seat across from where he would have been, just for a moment, just long enough to see the diner from his perspective, the counter stretching across the room, the door in clear view, the constant flow of people coming and going. And she realized how easy it would have been for him to watch everything without being seen, how simple it was to fade into the background if no one chose to look closely. And her fingers brushed lightly against the tabletop, tracing the faint outline of where the bowl had rested, and she let out a quiet breath, her gaze lowering as if listening for something that was no longer there. And then, almost without thinking, she reached beneath the table, her hand moving along the edge of the booth seat. And for a second there was nothing, just the smooth vinyl. But then her fingers caught on something small, something tucked just out of sight, and she paused, her breath stilling as she carefully pulled it free, revealing a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges like it had been handled more than once. And Ava stared at it for a moment, the noise of the diner fading slightly in her ears, before she slowly unfolded it, her hand steady but her chest tightening just enough to remind her that this moment mattered. And as the paper opened, catching the soft light above, she felt that same quiet pull again, stronger now, like the answer she had not been asking was finally beginning to surface. The paper felt lighter than it should have, thin and fragile between Ava's fingers as she held it just above the table, the edges slightly curled like it had been folded and unfolded more times than paper was meant to endure, and for a moment she did not open it fully, her eyes tracing the faint creases instead, as if trying to read something from the shape alone, while around her the diner continued its steady rhythm, the low murmur of voices blending with the soft clatter of dishes, a world moving forward without pause. And yet in that small space, in that quiet booth, time seemed to slow just enough for her to notice the way her own breathing had changed, a little deeper, a little more careful, like she was stepping into something she did not fully understand. And then she unfolded the paper the rest of the way, her movements deliberate, almost respectful, and her eyes settled on the handwriting, neat but slightly uneven. Like it had been written with effort, with intention, each letter placed carefully as if it mattered that it be read exactly as it was meant, and she read the first line silently, her lips parting just slightly as the words settled in. "Thank you for seeing me." And Ava blinked once, her gaze holding on the sentence longer than expected, because it was simple, almost too simple, and yet it carried a weight she could not ignore. And she continued, her eyes moving slowly across the page. "Not many people do." And something in her chest tightened, not sharply, not painfully, but enough to make her aware of it, enough to make her pause again, her thumb pressing lightly against the edge of the paper as if to steady herself, and the sounds of the diner seemed to fade just a little more, not gone, but distant, like they belonged to another room, another moment, and she read on. "I will not forget what you gave me, even when I had nothing to give back." And Ava exhaled softly through her nose, the words settling into her in a way that felt unfamiliar, like they were meant for someone else, someone stronger, someone more certain, but they were here, in her hands, in his handwriting, and she could not step away from that. And at the bottom of the note, just before the fold, there was one more line, written slightly smaller, almost as if it had been added after a moment of hesitation. "Some people carry more than they show." And Ava's eyes lingered there, the sentence echoing quietly in her mind, and she lowered the paper just slightly, her gaze shifting toward the empty seat across from her, as if expecting him to be there, to explain, to give the words a voice. But the booth remained still, unchanged, holding only the faint imprint of presence that had already slipped away, and Ava swallowed, her throat tightening just enough to remind her she was still standing in the middle of a working diner, still part of the motion and noise and expectation that defined the place, and she carefully folded the paper back along its original lines, pressing the creases gently, as if preserving something fragile, something that should not be lost, and she slipped it into the pocket of her apron, her hand lingering there for a second longer than necessary, feeling the outline through the fabric, grounding herself again, before she stood up from the booth, smoothing her apron with a quiet motion, her expression returning to the calm, steady composure she carried through every shift. But something had shifted beneath it, something subtle but real, like a door she had not known was there had opened just enough to let something through. And as she stepped back into the flow of the diner, picking up a tray, answering a call from the counter, she found that the emptiness of the booth no longer felt like a question, but something else, something quieter, something that stayed with her even as the night moved forward, steady and unchanged on the surface, while underneath, something had begun. The next morning arrived quieter than the one before, the light outside softer, filtered through a thin layer of clouds that dulled the edges of everything, and Ava stepped into the diner with that same steady pace, her bag resting against her shoulder, her apron folded neatly in her hands. But there was a slight pause before she pushed the door open, a hesitation so small it could have gone unnoticed, except she felt it, the way her fingers lingered just a second longer on the handle, as if she already knew what she would see inside. And when the bell chimed and she stepped in, the familiar warmth met her again, the scent of coffee already brewing, the low hum of early customers settling into their seats, and her eyes moved instinctively toward the corner booth before anything else. And there it was, empty, unchanged, holding that same quiet stillness as if time had decided to leave it untouched. And Ava exhaled slowly, not surprised, not exactly disappointed either, but aware of the space in a way that felt more permanent now, less like waiting and more like something that had already passed. And she moved behind the counter, tying her apron with practiced ease, her hands finding their rhythm again, reaching for mugs, aligning plates, responding to orders. But beneath it all there was a new layer, something softer, something that stayed with her like a quiet echo. And after a few minutes, without thinking, she reached into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against the folded paper, feeling its presence there, grounding, real, and she pressed it lightly before letting her hand fall back to her side, as if reminding herself that it had not been imagined, that the words were still there, carried with her now. And the morning unfolded in its usual way, customers coming and going, conversations blending into one another, the steady rhythm returning. But Ava found herself moving through it with a slightly different awareness, noticing things she had not paid attention to before. The way a regular at the counter stirred his coffee, absent-mindedly without ever taking a sip. The way a young woman near the window stared at her phone with a tight expression. The way a man in a suit checked his watch every few seconds as if time owed him something. And Ava watched them briefly, quietly, not judging, just seeing. The way the note had said. And when the clock moved closer to the hour he used to arrive, she felt that familiar pull again, softer now, less sharp. And she stepped away from the counter, reaching for a bowl without being told, without being asked, her movements calm, intentional, and she prepared it the same way as before, careful, precise, the steam rising in gentle curls. And when she carried it across the diner, no one stopped her, no one questioned her this time. As if the moment had lost its edge, as if it had settled into something unspoken that no longer needed to be challenged. And she placed the bowl on the table in the empty booth, aligning it just slightly with the edge, her hand resting there. For a brief second, and she did not wait, did not look around to see if anyone noticed. She simply turned and walked back, her steps steady, her posture calm. And as she resumed her place behind the counter, something inside her felt quieter, not because the absence had disappeared, but because it had been acknowledged, accepted in a way that did not need resolution. And the diner continued around her, unchanged on the surface. But Ava carried that small shift with her, that subtle understanding that sometimes what mattered was not whether someone returned, but whether they had been seen at all. And as the morning light brightened slightly, pushing through the clouds and settling across the floor in soft patches, Ava glanced once more toward the booth, not expecting anything this time, just observing, just present. And the bowl sat there in the quiet, untouched, yet somehow no longer empty. The afternoon stretched slowly into evening again, the light outside fading into a muted gray that softened the edges of passing cars and blurred the line between day and night. And inside the diner the rhythm continued as it always did, steady and predictable. But Ava felt it differently now, like she was moving through something she understood a little more clearly, her steps measured, her hands precise. Yet her attention no longer fixed only on the tasks in front of her, because there was a quiet awareness that stayed with her, something that shifted the way she saw the space, the people, the small details that most would overlook. And as she carried a tray of coffee cups across the floor, she noticed how the corner booth seemed to exist in its own pocket of stillness, untouched by the movement around it. The bowl still resting there where she had placed it earlier, the surface now completely settled, no steam left, just a quiet reflection of the overhead light. And for a moment, she paused near the counter, her gaze lingering there not with expectation, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as if the absence itself had become part of the routine, part of the place. And behind her the manager called out another order, his voice sharp but familiar, no longer carrying the same edge it had before. And Ava turned, setting the tray down, responding with a calm nod, her voice steady as she repeated the order back. But even as she spoke, she could feel that small shift inside her, that subtle difference in the way she carried herself, not heavier, not lighter, just more aware. And as the evening wore on, the diner filled briefly before thinning again, customers coming and going in waves, each one bringing their own noise, their own presence, and leaving without a trace. And Ava watched them in passing, the way she had started to that morning, noticing the details that lingered just beneath the surface, the tired eyes, the distracted gestures, the quiet loneliness that did not always look like loneliness. And she wondered, not in words but in feeling, how many of them moved through their days unseen, How many sat in places like this without anyone truly noticing they were there? And the thoughts settled into her quietly, not heavy, but present, like something that would stay with her long after the shift ended. And when the clock moved closer to closing time, Ava wiped down the counter with slow, deliberate strokes, the scent of cleaning solution rising faintly, mixing with the lingering smell of coffee, and the diner began to empty, the noise softening into something closer to silence. And she glanced toward the booth again, one last time before she would have to clear it, before she would have to reset it like any other table. And for a moment she stood still, her hand resting lightly on the counter, her breathing even. And then she stepped away, crossing the floor with quiet intention, her shoes barely making a sound against the tile. And she reached the booth, standing beside it as she had done before, her eyes moving over the familiar arrangement, the bowl, the spoon, the space that still felt held in a kind of quiet pause. And she reached out, her fingers wrapping gently around the edge of the bowl, preparing to lift it, to finally clear what had been left untouched all day. But just as she began to move, the bell above the door chimed softly, the sound cutting through the stillness with a subtle clarity that made her pause, her hand still resting against the bowl, her body held in that brief moment between action and stillness. And she turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge the sound, her eyes shifting toward the entrance as the door opened, letting in a thin stream of cool evening air. And for a second everything seemed to hold, the light, the sound, the space itself waiting on something not yet revealed. And Ava remained where she was, quiet, steady, her hand still on the bowl, as if she understood that whatever came next did not need to be rushed. The door did not slam or creak, it simply opened with a quiet ease, the bell above it giving a soft, single chime that seemed to linger longer than it should have. And Ava turned just enough to see, without fully stepping away from the booth, her hand still resting lightly against the bowl, her fingers unmoving as if anchored to that moment. And the man who stepped inside did not rush, did not hesitate either. He moved with a kind of quiet certainty that carried through the room without needing to announce itself, his coat tailored, his posture straight, his presence drawing subtle attention without a word. And for a second the diner shifted, not in sound but in awareness, a few heads turning, a conversation pausing mid-sentence, the air adjusting around someone who clearly did not belong to this place, and yet walked into it, as if he had every right to be there. And Ava watched him without staring, her gaze steady but calm, taking in the details the way she had begun to notice everything lately, the clean lines of his suit, the polished shoes, the way his eyes moved across the room not in curiosity but in recognition, as if he was looking for something specific. And then his gaze settled on the corner booth, on the bowl still resting there, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, just enough to register, a quiet confirmation. And Ava felt it before she understood it, that subtle connection between presence and absence, between what had been left behind and what had now arrived. And the man stepped forward, his footsteps measured, the sound of them soft against the tile, and he stopped just a few feet from the booth, his eyes lingering on the table, on the bowl, on the space that had held someone else not long ago. And Ava straightened slightly, her hand finally lifting from the bowl as she faced him more fully now, her posture composed, her expression calm but attentive. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching just enough to carry weight without becoming uncomfortable. And then he nodded once, almost to himself, before looking at her, his voice when it came low, controlled, but carrying something beneath it that felt personal. "You are the one who kept bringing him food." And it was not a question, not really, more like a statement shaped into words. And Ava did not rush to answer. She simply met his gaze, steady, grounded, and gave a small nod, her voice quiet but clear. "Yes." And the man exhaled slowly, not visibly dramatic, just a slight release of something held, and his eyes shifted back to the booth again, taking in the details as if each one mattered, as if each one told part of a story he had not been there to witness. And Ava watched him, the way his shoulders held a certain tension beneath the composed exterior, the way his focus did not waver. And she understood without being told that this moment carried more than it showed, that whatever connection he had to the man who had sat there was not casual, not distant. And the diner around them seemed to quiet again, not completely, but enough that the space between them felt separate from everything else. And Ava rested her hand lightly against the back of the booth now, no longer holding the bowl, no longer preparing to clear it, just present, just aware, and the man finally looked back at her, his expression softer now, though still controlled, and he said, more quietly this time, "My name is Ethan Whitmore." And the name did not mean anything to the room, not to the clinking cups or the hum of the kitchen, but in the way he said it. It carried weight, history, something larger than the space could hold, and Ava did not react outwardly, did not shift or question. She simply listened, the same way she had listened before, and Ethan's gaze returned once more to the booth, to the bowl, to the quiet presence that lingered there, and he added, after a brief pause, his voice just slightly lower, "The man who sat here was my father," and the words settled into the space between them, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And Ava felt it then, not as surprise, but as a quiet confirmation of everything she had sensed without knowing, everything that had been present beneath the surface. And she remained still, her breathing even, her posture steady, as the moment unfolded exactly as it needed to, without urgency, without noise, just truth arriving in its own time. The words did not echo, they settled, quiet and heavy in the space between them, and Ava felt them land somewhere deeper than sound, not as shock but as clarity, like a piece of something she had already understood finally taking shape. And she held Ethan Whitmore's gaze for a moment longer, her expression unchanged on the surface, calm, steady, but behind it there was a shift, a quiet alignment of everything she had seen, everything she had felt without naming, and her eyes moved. Briefly to the booth, to the bowl still resting there, untouched yet no longer empty in the same way, and then back to him, and she spoke simply, her voice even. He came in every day. And the statement carried no weight of explanation, just truth, and Ethan nodded once, slow, deliberate, his jaw tightening slightly, as if holding something in place, and he stepped closer to the booth, his hand hovering just above the edge of the table before resting there lightly, his fingers pressing against the surface as if grounding himself in something real, something that had been part of his father's last days. And Ava watched the movement, the restraint in it, the way his presence filled the space without disrupting it, and for a moment neither of them spoke again, the diner continuing around them in softened layers of sound, distant, secondary, and then Ethan exhaled quietly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, and he said, more to the table than to her. He was not supposed to be here. And Ava did not respond right away, not because she did not understand, but because she did, in a way that did not require words, and Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the booth, his voice steady but carrying something beneath it, something that had been held back for longer than this moment. He left everything behind. He continued, his gaze flickering briefly, not away, but inward, his name, his company, his life, all of it. And Ava listened, her posture unchanged, her attention complete, the way it had been every time the old man had sat here. And she understood then that what had seemed like absence was not emptiness, but choice. And Ethan finally looked at her again, his expression no longer guarded in the same way, still composed, but softer at the edges, more human than before, and he asked, quietly, "Did he ever say anything to you?" And Ava reached into her apron without hesitation, her fingers finding the folded paper as if they had been waiting for this moment, and she pulled it out carefully, holding it for a second before extending it toward him, not dramatically, not with explanation, just offering it as it was, and Ethan took it with a measured movement, his hand steady, but his grip tightening slightly as the paper settled into his palm, and he unfolded it slowly, his eyes scanning the words in silence. And Ava watched his expression shift in small, almost imperceptible ways, the tension in his jaw easing, the line of his shoulders softening. And when he reached the final line, he paused, his gaze holding there, his breath slowing just enough to notice. And for a moment the space between them felt still again, not empty, not waiting, but complete in a way that did not need to be filled. And Ethan folded the paper back along its creases, more carefully than before, as if preserving something that could not be replaced. And he looked at Ava once more, his voice lower now, quieter, carrying something closer to gratitude than anything else. He did not let many people see him. And Ava gave a small nod, her voice just as steady. He did not have to. And the simplicity of it settled between them, not as agreement, but as understanding. And Ethan glanced once more at the booth, at the bowl, at the quiet space that had held something. Neither of them could fully explain, and for the first time since he had entered, there was no tension in the way he stood there, only a stillness that felt earned, and Ava remained beside the booth, her hand resting lightly against the back of the seat, not holding on, not letting go, just present, as the moment moved forward without needing anything more. The quiet between them did not break. It shifted, like something unseen had moved just slightly beneath the surface, and Ethan Whitmore remained standing beside the booth, the folded note still in his hand, his fingers resting against it as if it carried more than paper and ink, and Ava did not step away, did not fill the space with unnecessary words. She simply stood there, her presence steady, grounded, the same way it had been every time his father had sat in that seat, and for a moment the diner seemed to recede even further, the distant clatter of dishes and low conversations blending into a muted background that no longer demanded attention, and Ethan glanced down at the bowl again, his gaze lingering there as if it held a question he had not yet asked, and then he looked at Ava, his voice measured, quieter now. How long? And Ava understood what he meant without needing more, her answer simple, direct, every day for the past week. And Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing that, the weight of time settling differently when it was counted in small acts instead of numbers, and he let out a breath, not heavy, not sharp, just a quiet release of something that had been held too tightly, and he stepped around the booth, sliding into the seat where his father had once sat, his movements deliberate, almost careful, as if he was aware of the space he was entering, and Ava watched him, not intruding, not retreating, just present, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the table, and Ethan placed the note down in front of him, his fingers smoothing it once before pulling the bowl slightly closer, his eyes studying it, the way someone might study something ordinary that had become meaningful, and for a second he did not move, did not speak, just sat there. The posture of a man who had always been in control now softened by something quieter, something more human, and then he reached for the spoon, his hand steady but slower than expected, and he took a small bite, not because he was hungry, not because he needed to, but because the action itself carried meaning, and Ava noticed the subtle shift in his expression, not dramatic, just a slight easing, a recognition of something that could not be explained in words, and he set the spoon down again, his gaze lowering briefly before lifting back to her, and there was something different in the way he looked at her now, not curiosity, not authority, but acknowledgement, and he said, quietly, he would not have eaten if it came from anyone else, and Ava did not smile, did not react outwardly. She simply nodded once, her voice calm. He did not trust easily, and Ethan's lips pressed together for a moment, a faint, almost invisible expression passing across his face, and he leaned back slightly, his eyes drifting around the diner as if seeing it for the first time, not as a place, but as a moment his father had chosen, and when he looked back at Ava, his voice carried something deeper now, something closer to reflection than statement. I spent years building things he did not need, chasing things he never cared about. And Ava listened, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and she did not offer advice, did not interrupt, because this was not a moment for answers. It was a moment for recognition, and Ethan exhaled again, slower this time, his shoulders settling into a stillness that felt different from before, less guarded, more open, and he reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small object, placing it gently on the table beside the bowl, a watch, worn but polished, its surface catching the light just enough to reveal the same details Ava had noticed before, and he looked at it briefly before speaking again, his voice low, almost to himself. He kept this with him, even when he left everything else behind. And Ava's eyes moved to the watch, recognizing it instantly, the quiet confirmation settling into her without surprise, and she looked back at Ethan, her expression unchanged, her voice soft but steady. Some things matter more when everything else is gone. And the words did not land as advice. They simply existed, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze returning to the watch, to the bowl, to the space that had held his father's final days in a way he had never been part of. And for a moment neither of them moved, the diner continuing around them, unchanged on the surface, while something deeper, something quieter, had shifted completely within that small, ordinary booth. The watch sat between them like a quiet witness, its worn surface catching the soft overhead light in brief, subtle glints, and Ethan's fingers rested near it without touching, as if even that small contact required more certainty than he was ready to claim. And Ava remained standing beside the booth, her posture steady, her presence unchanged, yet the air between them had shifted again, not heavier, not lighter, but more honest, like something carefully held had finally been set down. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the diner continuing its muted rhythm around them, the distant hum of the kitchen, the low murmur of a late customer finishing a meal, the soft scrape of a chair against tile, all of it moving forward as if unaware that something quiet and significant had just taken place. And Ethan's gaze lifted from the watch to Ava, his expression no longer guarded in the way it had been when he first entered, the sharp edges softened by something deeper, something that did not belong to control or status. And he said, his voice low but clear, "I spent months trying to find him." And Ava listened without interrupting, her attention complete, her eyes steady, and Ethan continued, his words measured, not rushed. "We searched everywhere he used to go, every place that made sense." And he paused briefly, his jaw tightening just slightly, as if acknowledging the truth beneath the statement. But he chose a place that did not belong to his world. And Ava's gaze flickered briefly around the diner, taking in the worn surfaces, the simple tables, the quiet corners that most people passed without a second thought. And she understood what he meant without needing explanation. And Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning back just enough to shift his weight, his hand finally brushing lightly against the watch, his thumb tracing its edge in a small, absent motion. And he added, quieter now. Maybe that was the point. And Ava gave a small nod, her voice calm, grounded. Sometimes people go where they can be seen without being judged. And the words settled into the space between them, not as an answer, but as something closer to truth. And Ethan looked at her differently then, not with curiosity, not with analysis, but with recognition, as if he was beginning to understand not just what she had done, but who she was in the moments no one else paid attention to. And he glanced once more at the booth, at the bowl, at the simple act that had carried more meaning than anything he had been able to offer, and his voice softened further, almost reflective. "I gave him everything he ever asked for, except time." And Ava did not respond immediately, because the weight of that did not need to be rushed, and when she did speak, her voice remained steady, unchanged. "You cannot give someone time after it is gone." And there was no judgment in it, no criticism, just a quiet acknowledgement of something neither of them could change. And Ethan nodded once, slowly, his eyes lowering for a brief second before lifting again, and the tension that had once defined his presence seemed to have settled into something quieter, something more grounded. And he reached for the note again, unfolding it once more as if the words might read differently now, might carry something new. And Ava watched him, not intruding, not guiding, just allowing the moment to exist as it was. And when he finished reading, he folded it carefully, more precise than before, as if each crease mattered, and he placed it beside the watch, the two objects resting together on the table, simple, unremarkable to anyone else, but holding something neither of them needed to explain. And Ethan finally looked at Ava again, his voice carrying something that had not been there before, something closer to humility than authority. "You gave him something I did not know he needed." And Ava did not shift, did not react beyond a small, almost imperceptible breath, and she replied quietly, "I just saw him." And the simplicity of it settled over everything, over the booth, the diner, the space between them. And for a moment there was nothing else to add, nothing else required. Just two people standing in a place that had become more than it appeared, holding a truth that did not need to be spoken any louder than it already had been. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt complete, like something had finally settled into place without needing to be forced. And Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, his gaze moving once more between the watch, the folded note, and the bowl, each object holding a piece of something he had not been present for. something he could not go back and change, and Ava stood where she was, her posture steady, her presence quiet but unwavering, and the diner around them continued to breathe in its own rhythm, the soft hum of machines, the faint clink of dishes being stacked in the kitchen, the low murmur of the last customer preparing to leave, all of it grounding the moment in something real, something ordinary. And yet what existed between them no longer felt ordinary at all, and Ethan finally reached forward, his hand closing gently around the watch, lifting it with care as if it carried more than time. And he turned it over once in his palm before slipping it back into his coat, not hiding it, but keeping it close. And then he took the note, folding it once more along its careful lines before placing it inside his inner pocket, his movements deliberate, respectful, and when he stood, the shift in his posture was subtle, but clear, the weight he had carried when he entered no longer pressing down in the same way, replaced by something quieter, something steadier, and he looked at Ava, not as someone passing through, not as someone separate from his world, but as someone who had become part of something he would not forget, and his voice when he spoke carried that change, not loud, not commanding, but sincere. I cannot repay what you did. And Ava did not move, did not react beyond a slight tilt of her head, her expression calm, and she answered simply, you do not have to. And there was no hesitation in it, no expectation behind it, just truth. And Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, as if measuring the weight of those words, before giving a small nod, not out of agreement, but out of understanding. And he glanced once more at the booth, at the place where something small had become something lasting. And then he reached into his coat again, pulling out a card, plain, understated, offering it toward her without insistence, without pressure, and Ava looked at it briefly before taking it, her fingers brushing against his for just a second, a simple exchange, nothing more, and she did not examine it right away, did not read the name or the number. She simply held it, as she had held the note, as she had held the moment, and Ethan spoke once more, quieter now. If you ever need anything. And he did not finish the sentence, did not need to, because the offer was clear, but Ava shook her head gently, not rejecting him, but clarifying something, her voice soft, steady. If I need something, I will earn it. And there was no pride in it, no defiance, just a quiet certainty about who she was. And Ethan's expression shifted again, a faint acknowledgement passing through his eyes, something close to respect, and he lowered his hand, not withdrawing the offer entirely, but accepting her answer as it was given. And for a moment they stood there in that shared understanding, neither above the other, neither diminished, just two people connected by something neither of them had planned. And then Ethan turned, his steps measured as he moved toward the door, the bell chiming softly as he opened it, the cool evening air slipping in once more. And he paused just before stepping out, not turning back, but holding for a brief second as if marking the moment, before continuing on, the door closing behind him with a quiet finality, and Ava remained where she was, the card still in her hand, the booth still in front of her, and the diner settling back into its familiar rhythm, unchanged on the surface, but carrying something new beneath it, something that would not leave with him, something that had already taken root in a place most people would never think to look. The door had long since closed, the soft chime of the bell fading into the background like it had never happened, and yet the space he left behind did not feel empty. It felt settled, like something had come to rest exactly where it was meant to, and Ava stood there for a moment longer, the card still held lightly between her fingers, her gaze not fixed on anything in particular, just present, just breathing in the quiet shift that lingered in the air, and slowly, almost without thinking, she slipped the card into her apron pocket beside the folded note, the two resting together now, not as symbols of anything owed, but as reminders of something that had already been given. And she turned back toward the diner, toward the counter, toward the small, steady world that had not changed in appearance, and yet everything felt just slightly different beneath it. And as she reached for a cloth and began wiping down the surface in front of her, her movements were the same as they had always been, measured, precise, grounded in routine, but there was a quiet warmth that followed each motion now, something subtle that did not demand attention but refused to leave, and the last customer gathered their things and stepped out into the night. the door closing softly behind them, leaving the diner in a gentle stillness broken only by the faint hum of the lights and the distant sound of the kitchen settling for the evening. And Ava moved toward the corner booth once more, her steps unhurried, her presence calm, and she stood beside it, looking down at the table that had held more than it ever appeared to. The bowl now empty, the space no longer waiting, just existing as it was, and she reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against the surface, tracing the outline where everything had taken place. And for a moment she allowed herself to feel it fully, not the absence, not the loss, but the quiet fullness of having been part of something that mattered in a way that could not be measured. And she lifted the bowl carefully this time, not hesitating, not holding on, just completing what needed to be done. And as she carried it back toward the kitchen, the soft light above the booth flickered once, before settling again, casting a warm glow over the empty seat. And Ava did not look back, not because she was leaving it behind, but because she did not need to. And as she placed the bowl in the sink, the sound of water running briefly filling the quiet, she caught her reflection in the small metal surface nearby, distorted but present, and she paused for just a second, her eyes meeting that reflection, steady, calm, unchanged on the outside, but carrying something deeper now, something that did not need to be explained. And when she turned back toward the diner floor, the space felt the same, the counter, the tables, the door, all exactly as they had been. And yet there was a softness to it now, a quiet sense of something unseen but understood. And Ava stepped back into her place behind the counter, folding her cloth neatly, setting it aside, her hands coming to rest for a brief moment before she reached for the next task. And the night continued, steady, ordinary, and somewhere beneath it all, something lasting remained, not in the objects left behind, not in the words that had been spoken, but in the simple act of having seen someone when no one else had. And that was enough, more than enough, to carry forward, quietly, without noise, without recognition, just a small, steady warmth that did not fade.